Alright everybody, welcome back to another edition of Bear's Guide 205. It is time to finally say we are in review mode. Now, I am recording this from home, so it is going to sound kind of echoey and boomy, so I apologize for that. But we're going to jump right into it. We have a lot of stuff to cover, and I'm going to try and keep this video as short as possible. As always, I know I don't expect you to take notes on this. This is more of a review. If you want to write down any notes, you can. And yeah, we'll go from there. So let's jump on in. So some of the topics for Unit 1 include, and we're going way back in time, to things like maps and projections, scale, regions, diffusions, some other stuff involving like GPS and GIS. But what you want to take into account this time is go, okay, I learned this stuff months ago. How is it that the new information I learned applies to this stuff? So first off, with projections, this is the very first lesson we had. It's the idea that we're trying to take the round Earth and put it onto a flat surface. And we know that's impossible because you can't take a 3D spherical object and put it on a flat sheet of paper. So of course something is going to distort, and we have different projections that have different distortions. Right? We have the Mercator map that preserves direction, distorts size, especially in the north and south poles. We have the good projection. It preserves the shape of everything, but it distorts distance with these weird shape that it makes out of the Earth. We have the fuller projection, which has perfect size, but completely distorts distance and direction. You can see the proper sizes of things, but you really don't know where you are. We have the Robinson projection, which is used in most classrooms. It kind of messes up everything a little bit, so we kind of just accept it. We have the azimuthal projection, or the polar projection, which shows only one part of the Earth, so then the distortion or the downside to this is that you can't see like the other side. And then we move on to our different types of maps. So there's our thematic maps and our reference maps. Thematic maps show us data, right? They either show it through a topomap, a choropleth map, dot map, cartogram. These are meant to show us data, while reference maps show us location, right? That's the two ways to separate types of maps. So we know topomaps show us elevation using isolines, because it's hard to show elevation on a flat piece of paper. We have into our other thematic maps, our choropleth map, which uses color to show information, and we know the downside to this is that it's not specific enough because it's painting these broad strokes of data across the areas. Then you have your dot map. Your dot maps are great because it does specifically show where this data is, but the downside is that in smaller areas you can't tell the difference between a bunch of clustered dots. So maybe that's where a choropleth map would be better. Or you could use graduated symbol, which does somewhat of the same thing as dot and somewhat of the same thing as choropleth, but once again, once it starts getting a little too crowded, you can't really tell the difference. And then finally, switching gears completely from thematic maps showing data, we switch to reference maps. Now we know all maps, like the one that you see on my classroom wall, the one that you see on Google Maps, those are all reference maps. But a special type of reference map is a cognitive reference map, or a mind map. These are ones that people draw based off memory, and they only include things that people like remember. Alright, now we're going to talk about scale, and scale is probably the one thing that you want to carry with you to all the other units, because scale, not only does it reference this idea of, you know, a distance on a map versus real life. When we talk about the scale of analysis, how large or how small is our scale, and how does that affect the data we're looking at? So remember that scale is counterintuitive. That means if you have a large scale, you're looking at a map of a small area, like a neighborhood. And if you have a small scale, that means you have a very large map. That means you could be looking at the entire world. So remember, data that you try to assess on maps is going to look differently when you have a very small scale looking at a global map, versus when you zoom all the way into a neighborhood, increase the scale completely, you get a different set of data based on your scale of analysis. Something you could definitely use on the AP exam to impress the readers. So here's an example. So in the United States, if we were using a small scale and looked at the entire United States, we would see that Florida is all oranges, right? Everything in Florida would be oranges, and anybody outside of Florida would be like, wow, Florida must be made of oranges. But if you increase the scale, you make the scale larger by zooming in and making the map smaller, then you have changed your scale of analysis. And if we're looking just at Florida, we would see that oranges are grown in parts of Florida, but then there's also like cities and urban areas, there's ranching areas, and the data changes. All right, on to regions. So regions it's an area with similar characteristics, and there are different types of regions. We organize regions differently based on what we're looking at. So the first one right away are formal regions. These are regions that have identifiable borders and one shared characteristic, at least one shared characteristic. It can be physical or cultural. That physical characteristic can be literally the world regions, North America, South America, Western Europe, Eastern Europe, all those that we talked about. But they can also be cultural. They could be tied to agriculture. They can be tied to language. They could be tied to religion. It really can be anything with formal regions. It's the idea that in that region they share at least one characteristic. Then you get to functional regions. Functional regions are where it's based on a node or a center point. These are also called nodal regions. And then based on the center or the node, it has a certain area it reaches out to. And the best way to understand these is like your local pizza place. You call the pizza place down the street and they'll deliver to you. You don't call the pizza place 10 miles away and ask them to deliver to you because you're not in their functional region, right? Or radio stations. When you're in the car and you're driving, you're having a road trip, you're listening to a Tampa radio station, all of a sudden you're going north, 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 and then the radio station cuts out because you're no longer in the functional region of that radio station, right? These are just some examples that you can use. All right, and then vernacular regions are perceptual ones. These are kind of like our mind maps, except with regions. We don't know exactly where they start and stop, we just know that they exist. Right? When you go into the South, you're like, this is the South, but what makes the South of the United States or the Midwest? And it can be a mixture of things. It can be religion, language, culture, tradition, geography, but it's really up to the people to decide, and no one really knows where it starts and stops, but you're there once you're there. Then we talk about spatial interaction, and mostly we're talking about here about space-time compression. So we understand that as the world changes and we're becoming more and more connected, that we are becoming more closely intertwined, right? So now we don't necessarily have to travel somewhere to talk to somebody. We can send, instant text messages and emails and stuff like that. So the world is experiencing space-time compression, and we have the ability to communicate and transport things at a faster rate. And more of this comes definitely into play later in the curriculum, but what matters is if you're looking at this and you can apply it to the later chapters that we talked about. All right, and then we get to diffusion. So there's two types of diffusion. There's relocation diffusion and there's expansion diffusion. So let's start off with relocation diffusion and keep it easy. Relocation diffusion is the spread of something through migration, literally people getting up and moving to a new place and bringing that thing with them. Right? While expansion diffusion, the people don't necessarily need to move with it. It's going to spread through different types of people. And the three types we have of that are contagious, stimulus, and hierarchical. So look, there's two main categories of diffusion, right? Relocation and expansion. We don't have to talk anymore about relocation. There's not subcategories of relocation. It just is relocation. Expansion has three subcategories or three types, and that's what we're going to get into. So, contagious is the first one. Spreads outward from a central point, spreading to every area around it. This essentially means that this idea or this thing can spread to people. It doesn't matter who it is. It doesn't matter what level of social hierarchy they're part of or how much money they have. Everybody's affected by it. For example, when a really catchy song is on the radio, everybody listens to it. It doesn't matter who you are or where you are. Everybody's going to be singing that song. It's going to affect everybody. Everybody's going to know it. Whereas hierarchical spreads through levels of power and importance. And that doesn't mean like the rich people first and then the poor people. But that could be like if you invent something, then you're the first person, you're that level of power or importance, and then the group that tests that thing, and then the larger group that tests that thing, and then eventually it goes out to everybody in the world, right? It's that idea that there's steps to it. And some people aren't going to get that diffusion or that idea diffuse to them in a hierarchical. Now, some ideas can start as hierarchical and then eventually become contagious to where everybody gets it. And then finally, we have stimulus diffusion, which is an underlying characteristic or idea that spreads, but specific characteristics do not. For example, the best one is a smartphone. Everybody has a smartphone. That idea exists in all types of smartphones. But then Apple took that idea of a smartphone and made the iPhone. Google took that idea of a smartphone and made the Pixel. And then, Android took that and made Android phones. So it's the idea that you have the basic idea and then change it to exactly what you want. All right, and then we move on to our topic of absolute and relative location, starting with absolute location. This is pretty simple and straightforward. This is just talking about the precise location on the planet's surface. We use longitude and latitude to find it, or meridians and parallels. Remember, the prime meridian is 0 degrees longitude. It passes through England. All the other meridians are 180 east or west, and the equator is 0 degrees latitude. Know how to place absolute location with latitude and longitude. It's a pretty straightforward. While relative location is the description of a place in relation to other human or physical features, right? So when we talk about, where's your house in relation to a gas station or a school or, a grocery store, this is how we use relative location. It's not absolute, it's just what's near other things. All right. Then we talk about distance decay, real simple theory here. As distance between two things increases, the level of interaction decreases. But we also know that this is proven incorrect now because of space-time compression, because of globalization, because of technology, advances in communications and technology. So this doesn't really play into anything anymore. All right, and finally we're going to move to cultural ecology. We know that culture, you've talked about culture a million times, you're going to talk about it a million more times. It's the total knowledge, the traits, the attitudes, the behaviors, everything that's transmitted in members of society. And cultural ecology is the study of the human-environment relationship. And one of those theories is the theory of environmental determinism, that human behavior is strongly affected by the physical environment, or the physical environment determines social development, right? The idea that if your environment poses challenges, you will overcome those challenges and be better. But if your environment doesn't give you any challenges, then you never improve. And then you have the theory of environmental possibilism, where it says the physical environment may limit some human actions, but people have the ability to adjust to their environment. The people determine their social development. It doesn't matter if there's limitations or not limitations put on you. All people can develop. And that's where we get that kind of, we look down on environmental determinism because it's a little racist. And while more people tend to accept environmental possibilism, because determinism, if we say that your environment challenges you and you overcome those challenges and that makes your society more developed or better, it's really in a way to support the idea that people in northern climates were better off, were more advanced because they had challenges, while people in tropical climates had what claimed to be no challenges to advance their society. And we know that people in the north have a certain skin color and people near the equator have a different skin color. So that's definitely how it could be interpreted as racist and go on later to promote colonialism and all that. But we'll get into that another time. All right, we have GPS. This is the easy part. Global Positioning System, a series of satellites that can be used to triangulate a person's position on Earth. Guys, GPS finds your absolute location. That's it. Keep it simple. You know what I mean? That's all GPS does, is it finds your absolute location on Earth using some satellites. It's what we use when we use literally the GPS in our phones. While remote sensing is satellites taking pictures and scanning the surface of the Earth and transmitting that image, right? So satellites doing two different things. Satellites for GPS are finding your absolute location. Satellites for remote sensing are trying to take data from the Earth's surface. And then, so we have this difference between them, but then once we get that data from remote sensing, well, what do we do with it? Well, we have to map it, and that's where GIS comes in, the Geographic Information System, where you take a picture of a map and then you lay across, different data points at different scales of analysis to maybe find some correlation between things. And we've seen this all throughout the year talking about AP Human, and all the different maps that we've analyzed, population distributions or religious distributions, language distributions, agricultural distribution, where industry is placed. All these different things is what people are using to analyze data from whatever they're looking at, whatever scale of analysis or whatever map they're viewing. So what do you need to know by the end of this? Basically, everything from Unit 1. It's really straightforward stuff. It's really foundational stuff. It seems really straightforward, and it is pretty easy. But what you want to think about, and I've said this before, is how it applies to everything we have covered, right? How can you apply this to population or migration? How can you apply this to religion or language, development, agriculture? These are the things that we want to think about. So, as always, this was the first installment in the review series for AP Human Geography. This is Bear's Guide 205. Make sure you hit that like button and subscribe. Definitely make sure to hit the bell so you get notifications when I update with new videos, because I'm going to try and do my best to get you guys prepared for the AP exam and get you all the videos necessary. So, till next time.